What's good, YouTube? Welcome back. Thank you for clicking onto this reaction. I hope you're looking forward to it just as much as I am. If you haven't already, head over to the content creators page. That link is in the description box down below. If you haven't already and you're enjoying our content, you know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but we're going to jump straight into this one.
In October 2021, the Russian army started a build-up on the Russia-Ukraine and Belarus-Ukraine borders. The Kremlin explained it with planned military exercises. Brushing aside...
Mate, I couldn't believe when this happened. I really couldn't believe when this happened. I was talking to a friend of mine and I was gobsmacked. Absolutely gobsmacked. Because I thought I had the possibility of happening, but I just never thought it was going to actually happen. When I heard that they were building up the forces, it was always scary.
All concerns, and declaring that they had a right to move their forces wherever they deemed necessary within their borders. But soon the United States started asserting that the massing of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border was a build-up for an impending invasion of Ukraine. The Russian government vehemently denied this, while some NATO states and Ukraine considered the US reports exaggerated. Nevertheless, by December...
That's what we thought, I thought it was exaggerated.
Russia started making demands for NATO to guarantee that Ukraine would never join the organization, that the alliance would withdraw its forces from countries that joined the alliance after 1997, that NATO...
Oh, wait. I need to rewind that to make sure I heard that correctly.
That Ukraine would never join the organization, that the alliance would withdraw its forces from countries that joined the alliance after 1997.
So not only did they want... I didn't know that information. And that's very interesting. So not only did they ask Ukraine... they asked NATO to not ever include Ukraine, but any states that joined after 1997, so Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia and Romania all also have their application withdrawn, so they're no longer in NATO. What was Russia really expecting? You're forcing NATO, you're asking too much of them at that point, right? Asking all those extra countries to have their application withdrawn? That's a big ask.
That NATO would stop its expansion.
DZ, you didn't think they were going to invade. You thought that they were after some negotiations or something. Yeah, I also agreed. I thought that they were trying to sort of, like at a poker table, you sort of show how many chips you have. The more chips you have, the more you can sort of play and gamble with. And that's what I thought they were sort of doing for sure.
That NATO would seek agreement with Russia for any activities in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia. Naturally, the United States and its allies rejected these proposals.
It had
Despite
to.
the Russian assurances and attempts of Western leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron to find common ground, the tensions continued growing. On the 17th of February, forces of the unrecognized Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and Ukraine accused each other of shelling. Unrecognized governments of Donetsk and Luhansk ordered the evacuation of their populations. On the 21st of February 2022, the Russian President Vladimir Putin made a threatening speech, questioning Ukrainian statehood and calling it a Bolshevik-created entity. On the same day, Russia became the first country to recognize the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, justifying this step by claiming that a genocide had been committed by the Ukrainian government and neo-Nazi groups against Russian-speaking people in Donbass. In the early morning of the 24th of February, Putin announced the start of the special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine.
Once again, you can see here Putin using the word Nazi, I think, because it's a triggering word. So they're trying to denazify Ukraine because they know that that's going to cause controversy. That's a triggering word and it's going to get people's attention. That's how that come across to me there.
A military conflict in Ukraine, which started in 2014, turned into a full-scale war with Russia's invasion. According to different estimates, Russia deployed 150,000 to 200,000 troops out of total active personnel of approximately 900,000.
So many troops, yet they still weren't able to achieve the goals that they set out to
Along
get.
with up to 40,000 separatists from Donetsk and Luhansk, later joined by a few thousand troops from Syria and separatist republics of Abkhazia and Ossetia. It is safe to assume that most of the best Russian troops were deployed to Ukraine. At the same time, the rest of the active personnel were mostly conscripts stationed throughout vast Russia. The Russian army divides into battalion tactical groups, BTG, which are autonomous military units consisting of infantry, armored and unarmored military vehicles, artillery, field hospitals, and so on. According to the latest
And how many battalion tactical groups were there?
invasion figures provided by the official US sources, Russia amassed approximately 120 BTGs on the border with Ukraine.
120 groups of BTGs. That's crazy. That's not many troops to invade a modern country. I thought it'd be quite a few infantry troops. Considering nowadays in modern warfare, I thought we would have used armoured units instead over actual infantry troops. So I think that is quite a large number of troops, honestly, in today's age. I thought it would be all modern sort of weaponised vehicular units.
BTGs usually have 600 to 1,000 infantrymen and are supposed to have 10 tanks and between 40 and 70 other armoured vehicles. This allows us to estimate that 1,200 tanks and 4,800 to 8,400 other armoured vehicles are being used in the Russian Expeditionary Force if all BTGs are equipped by the book.
See, now that looks small. To me, the infantry numbers look small, and so do the armoured. 1,200 tanks, that doesn't seem like that many at all.
Which is rarely the case, especially in an army known for vast corruption and poor administration. According to the ISS military balance, Russia possesses 1,391 military aircraft and 544 attack helicopters, but it is impossible to know how many of them Russia is exactly using in the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, how many are actually
The
operable?
same source shows that Ukraine has active personnel of approximately 200,000 troops, more than 3,000 armored vehicles, 132 military aircraft, and 55 helicopters.
That's crazy to think how little numbers the Ukraine had to fight against the Russian military to start off with. Obviously, they're getting a lot more help from the Western powers now with the new jets we're looking to send over, the new armoured vehicles that they're getting as well. So it's very interesting. But at the initial stages of the invasion, they were vastly outnumbered, weren't they? The armoured is pretty small, to be fair. Their armour was often caught along, which is also weird to me. Absolutely no infantry cover with their tanks. Yeah, I also agree, Jay, it's a bit weird. 1,200 tanks is a lot for a modern war when everything is compared to the outrageous World War II numbers. Everything seems small scale. Very, very true. Like, I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head there.
Since Ukraine has declared general mobilization and armed volunteer territorial defense, we could assume the actual number of people resisting the invasion is way higher. Moreover, thousands...
Yeah, because there's a lot more civilians sort of defending their land on the Ukrainian borders and regions. So they might not be active soldiers, but they're still fighting.
Thousands of volunteers joined Ukraine's International Brigade. While talking about the comparison of forces, it is necessary to note that the Ukrainian army has come a long way since 2014. The army has been significantly modernized. Its military arsenal is much better, as the United States, United Kingdom, Turkey, and others have provided Ukraine with anti-tank weapons like NLAW and Javelin, anti-aircraft missile systems such as Stinger, along with TB2 Bayraktar drones.
Okay, I didn't
Russian
realise about the
offensive
drones.
started with a massive shelling and airstrike campaign throughout Ukraine. with more than 100 missile strikes to destroy the Ukrainian military infrastructure, bases, anti-aircraft missile systems, and arms depots. The later events demonstrated that Russia failed to achieve its goal, as the Ukrainian military infrastructure, albeit heavily damaged, managed to mostly stay intact. This was followed by a ground offensive in 4 general directions.
I always got like, surely you would have thought they would have put a bigger push on Kiev, because they originally started with Kiev at the start, but then it seemed like they sort of stopped and retracted from that quite quickly. Yeah, the Ukrainian army is fighting since 2014 with rebels in Donbass, so they got the experience. That's very interesting. Also, I think you could probably say that when Russia took Crimea, that was really the initial start of this confrontation, which again I think was in around about 2014 when they took Crimea, I believe.
The northern offensive by the Russian troops deployed in Belarus towards the capital, Kiev. The eastern offensive from Belgorod towards Kharkiv. The Donbass southeastern offensive from the territories controlled by pro-Russian separatists and Voronezh towards the Ukrainian-controlled territories of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And the southern offensive from Crimea towards Kherson, Mykolaiv, and ultimately Odessa. It looks like the Russian strategy was to rapidly advance towards major urban centers, taking large cities like Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa as soon as possible to break the morale and resolve of the Ukrainians and force the government to capitulate, along with ensuring the land connection between the separatist-ruled part of Donbass and Crimea, and securing the whole Black Sea shore of Ukraine.
Okay, that makes sense. I was wondering why they were sort of trying to get so much area on the sort of southern area, but it makes sense. They wanted to be able to make it so that the region was able to connect. The Donbass region was also able to connect with Crimea, and they had a land way to be able to connect everything together. So that's very interesting. Logistic nightmare, you would think. So lots of vehicles had no fuel left near Kiev. They were subsequently left abandoned most of the time. Logistical nightmare, you think. So you think that's the reason why they weren't able to do as much of an advancement on Kiev. Surely they would have put all their sort of focus on that area, though. That's the capital. That's where the Zelensky was. Surely that was the main priority. Russia don't have the word logistics in their dictionary at this point. Yeah, but they took it relatively easy, unlike the Donbass region. Is that the Crimea you're talking about? They took Crimea relatively easy compared to Donbass, which would make more sense because they didn't start getting help until after 2014 from the west with the javelins and the other equipment. So that's probably why the Russians took Crimea so easily. The reason he pulled back from Kiev was because their lines were too extended and they simply didn't have the men to fight on such a long front. That makes sense. But again, you would have thought they would have sort of maybe put a priority to that one area and focused within that one area, secured that one area, and then gone for the next area. But I'm not a general, so what do I know, really?
These 4 offensive axes were supposed to merge after securing advances along the front line to make pincer and envelopment movements more possible. The exact political endgame of the Russian offensive still puzzles analysts, with claims ranging from installing a pro-Russian puppet government to dividing eastern Ukraine into several pro-Russian states.
I think the original plan was to storm Kiev, then install a pro-Russian regime. When they realised they weren't going to be able to get Kiev, they then basically diverted their plans to the Donbass region and the eastern part of Ukraine, and dividing it and taking up parts of it. Yeah, I think the original plan was to basically completely input a whole complete regime, which clearly wasn't going to happen. After a couple of weeks, they realised that was the case.
Ukrainian defense strategy was an orderly withdrawal to urban centers while fighting advancing Russian forces, bogging them down in urban warfare, ambushing and attacking their supply lines. It would be illogical for the Ukrainian army to defend all the terrain along
There was no way.
of the massive front.
They had to go, at that point in time, they had to go to guerrilla warfare. At this point in time, you're the invading force. This is our home country. We are just going to basically pick your lines off, make it difficult, and make it a war of attrition for you to get anything that you need, for sure. I would definitely recommend real life lore video on why Russia is invading Ukraine. It explains this conflict so well. I'll definitely give it a look after maybe a couple of episodes of this, DZ. Definitely interested, and that Jay's suggesting it as well. I'll definitely keep an eye on it.
The Russian advantage in firepower. The analyst Michael Kaufman calls this tactic trading space for time. On the first day of the invasion, Russia made the most significant advance on the southern front, where the 58th Combined Arms Army, CAA, advanced for about 60 kilometers, pushing the Ukrainian 57th Motorized Brigade back and taking the North Crimean Canal and reaching the outskirts of Kherson. On the northern front, the 35th CAA...
I really like the map and the animation that Kings&Generals are using here. I know it might be the fact that it's the Modern Warfare series, or it could just be the fact that it's a newer video, but I'm really enjoying it. The map they've sort of got here, very well made. It's easy to follow, and I like the rivers and everything.
CAA took Chernobyl and the Chernobyl power plant, while the 36th CAA pushed towards the capital Kiev, bypassing Chernihiv. The Ukrainian 1st Tank Brigade managed to halt the Russian advance, as it failed to capture the city of Chernihiv. The 41st CAA's advance towards Kiev from Sumy was also halted in the outskirts of Sumy by the 56th Motorized Brigade.
So once again, they're really getting sort of stopped at every small individual point here, it looks like. It looks like some of these easier places they thought to capture, they're getting sort of stalled at by one or two brigades or battalions from the Ukrainians.
The Russian airborne attack on the Hostomel airport near Kiev.
Oh, this is a cool animation.
31st Guards Air Assault Brigade of the Russian VDV, Elite Airborne Army, also failed after a Ukrainian counterattack. The rapid cap...
It's really not going well for them in this first initial stages, is it?
Kiev did not happen either, as the 1st Guards Tank Army could not break the resistance of the Ukrainian 92nd Mechanized Brigade. The advance of the Luhansk militia and the Russian 20th CAA towards Severodonetsk met the resistance of the Ukrainian 53rd Brigade, with heavy fighting around the town of Shtestya. Elements of the 8th CAA and the Donetsk militia pushed the 54th Mechanized Brigade towards the northwest from the Ukrainian DNR line of contact, and the 56th Motorized Brigade towards the east along the Black Sea shore, with heavy fighting around Mariupol.
Ukrainians really giving it all and just making it difficult for the Russians to get any inch at all. Their best success was taking a lot of the south and creating a land bridge to Crimea. I completely agree as well. DZ, they are getting stooped. Yeah, they're getting stopped at important cities. Oh, it's important cities, not insignificant cities like I thought. So thanks for sort of correcting me there.
But failed to reach its overall goals of taking over the rest of Donetsk Oblast and breaking the Ukrainian resistance. On the
Sorry for a second, I just want to look at that.
over
So-
the rest of Donetsk Oblast and
So it's saying that they didn't get the whole of the Donbass region. Can you see my mouse here? So is the Donbass region all of this? Is this the whole of the Donbass region? So they only got sort of this half here. And again, this Luhansk region, the People's Republic, does this go all the way up here? Yes, yeah, pretty much, perfect. All right, thanks guys. And you're saying that the annexation of Crimea is the main objective for Putin at this point. Any peace treaty would have have to include this being a part of Russia. I also do agree that it seems like the only sort of option is for Russia to get the whole of Crimea now. The front of Donbass is the hardest because it was the fortified and fought over for years. Ukraine army has the strongest fortifications there. Perfect. Cheers for keeping me updated, Dizzy.
On the 25th of February, heavy fighting on all fronts continued. The Russian troops forced their way into Oblon, a mere 9 kilometers away from the Ukrainian parliament building. The 95th Air Assault Brigade and the 72nd Mechanized Brigade were there to protect Kiev.
Nice.
At this point, the United States even offered Ukrainian President Zelensky a chance to leave the capital, to which he reportedly replied, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride."
And I tell you what now, all dues to Zelensky. He stayed there when he had the opportunity to go to the US, had the opportunity to flee, but he was staying until the end. Very, very inspirational. Very inspirational what he's doing for his country.
The threat to the capital was real, as during his speech to the nation, he called for the Ukrainians to brace for an offensive and urged them to prepare for a hard battle for Kiev. Zelensky's refusal to leave and insistence to fight against the odds turned him into a hero and the symbol of the Ukrainian resistance, further mobilizing Ukrainian society and galvanizing the international community to adopt crippling sanctions on Russia, such as disconnecting several major Russian banks from SWIFT. But the situation continued to be difficult for the Ukrainians. American intelligence predicted that the fall of Kiev would happen within 96 hours.
I remember hearing those sort of whispers and seeing those sort of reports online as well, that Kiev was close to falling, and it was a very worrying point in time, especially when you first heard that they sort of got control of Chernobyl and they were going past that. I was very, very keeping a close eye on this whole situation. Not so much any of my friends around me, and I was just encapsulated by it. It was scary that they were so close to Kiev.
Though the Russians failed to capture Sumy, they continued their march towards Kiev from there, advancing to Romny. On the southern front, the Russians developed their success by capturing Novokhovka and moving closer to securing Kherson and Melitopol. Taking Melitopol was essential to continue the march along the Black Sea shore to merge with Russian and separatist units trying to take Mariupol, along with advancing towards Zaporizhia, which could have encircled the Ukrainian units fighting on the Donbass front.
I'm assuming Russia also wanted to cut the Ukraine off from the Black Sea as well, which would make sense and make it sort of landlocked.
In Kharkiv and Donbass, the situation remained more or less stable, and there were even reports of Ukrainian counter-offensives pushing back the Russian units to the border in Milove. February 25th was also the day when the defenders of Zminy Island, south of Odessa, famously responded to a Russian demand of surrender. F*** off, Russian military ship. On February
Literally,
26th,
go away.
The Russian army mostly used special forces and airborne troops to fight the Ukrainian defense in Kiev. With the 36th CAA giving up on the rapid capture of Chernihiv and bypassing it to move towards the capital, it looked like other Russian units around Kiev were waiting for its arrival to strike Kiev with massive force.
Okay.
Similarly unable to take the city of Kharkiv with a direct assault, the 1st Guards Tank Army divided into 2 groups to bypass the city to possibly envelop the Ukrainian units in the city or move towards Kiev. The situation in the southeastern Donbass front remained relatively stable as well. The Russians...
So they're going for all these encirclement maneuvers, but they're not actually putting them into play. Is that correct? Yeah, I also agree. Zelensky is a goat indeed. Zelensky's Churchillian moment is a good one there, like, for sure. Imagine a president who fought his own battles. It's actually so good to see a president willing to sort of take up and fight for his own country. It's very, very, very inspirational. Crimea was transferred by Russia to Ukraine in 1954. Crimean history in particular is unique because Stalin deported Tartars to change the ethnic makeup of the area. That's very interesting as well. And then once again, like, Zelensky is the supreme commander of the Ukraine armed forces, who could give up if the boss himself is staying behind. I completely agree, and that's what makes him so inspirational, and it will keep the men there fighting for the Ukrainian land for as long as possible, which is needed in this type of fight.
Troops and separatist militia captured the port of Berdyansk and the Berdyansk airport. DPR separatists also claimed to capture Pavlopol and Pistyvy, while LNR separatists also claimed to seize Loposkina and Makivka. Russia continued its advance on the southern front. The 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division of the 58th CAA of the Russian army continued fighting in Kherson, while also sending units towards the city of Mykolaiv. Other elements of the 58th CAA were engaged in fighting to seize Melitopol, along with advancing towards Enerhodar and the Zaporizhian power plant in the north. Alexei Arestovich.
And they have that power point now, don't they? That was quite a big target for them, wasn't it?
The Ukrainian president admitted on February 27th that Ukraine lost control of the whole of Berdyansk. Prevailing in Kherson and Melitopol, capturing Henichesk and Kherson airport, meant that the Russian offensive on the southern front developed its success, increasing the threat on Mykolaiv and Odessa in the west and Mariupol in the east. The first reports of the Russian army merging its offensives in the southern and southeastern front around Mariupol also emerged on that day. But the continuing assault on Zaporizhia, namely on Enerhodar, Vasilivka and Tokmak, meant that the 58th CAA, the most successful unit of the Russian war effort so far, had to fight in 3 different directions, dividing its resources.
Once again, it seems like the Russians were very happy to have their sort of units spread out and diverse instead of converging on the same target together.
On other fronts, the situation remained more or less stable, as Russia made small gains, such as the capture of Kupiansk and the encirclement of Konotop. But the 41st CAA's attack on Prelude and the 1st Guards Tank Army's attacks on Kharkiv and Oktyrka were repelled. By now, it had become clear that the strategy of causing collapse of the Ukrainian defense by rapid mass offensive on major Ukrainian cities had failed, as the Ukrainian army not only remained functional in the cities, but also managed to harass Russian supply lines and inflict major losses on the Russian manpower and military vehicles.
They literally, they wanted to just storm the whole of Ukraine, take it over as quick as they could, but they just had no chance.
In response to the Western sanctions and failure to rapidly defeat the Ukrainian resistance, Putin ordered Russia's nuclear forces on high alert. The valiant defense of Ukraine caught the West by surprise, as contrary to almost unanimous expectation of the fall of Ukraine, the Ukrainian army remained a force capable of defending the country. As a result, for the first time in history, the EU announced direct military aid to a foreign country, Ukraine, while Germany made a major turn in its foreign policy by sending weapons to Ukraine and stating its intention to dramatically increase its military spending.
Now, I didn't realise that the European Union for the first time sent aid to a foreign country, which would be the Ukraine. I didn't know that, but it does make sense now, sort of mentioned.
But Russia still possessed major resources sufficient to defeat Ukraine. On February 28th, satellite images of a 64-kilometer-long massive column of tanks, military vehicles and artillery moving from Belarus.
I remember when the photos and the stories of all this sort of come up. These were these all got left in the end, didn't they?
Belarus towards the western part of Kiev were shared on social media. Along with that, on the Kiev front, elements of the 41st and 36th CAAs moved to bypass Sumy and Chernihiv to merge with an aim to make a push towards East Kiev. Presumably, the overall goal was to attack Kiev from a number of directions, but the maintenance of a formidable force by Ukraine in Chernihiv and Sumy oblasts caused a major threat to the extended supply lines of the Russian army. Elements of the Ukrainian 1st Tank Army conducted defensive actions against the 41st and 36th CAAs, stalling the Russian advance in Nizhin. Along with maintaining a solid defense around Kiev, the Ukrainian forces also engaged in pointed counterattacks, such as in Makariv and Borodyanka.
See, once again, I didn't realise they were doing too many counter-attacks in the initial parts of the invasion. I thought it was all just defensive measures. So, yeah, it's interesting that there was some defence sort of being taken as well. Giving up Crimea to the Ukraine was the single dumbest decision. I can't pronounce the ex-Russian president's name. So it was his biggest mistake, and you all sort of agree. First Guard tank army, elite army since the World War II, not being able to take a city next to its border is absolutely crazy. I also agree, Jay. The fact that an elite, experienced armoured unit wasn't able to do its job is worrying, so indeed. And Russia tried to intimidate Europe, and the way it backfired is absolutely hilarious. Yeah, Europe just sort of said, we're not scared of you, we are going to send everything we need to Ukraine. Don't try and bully us, Russia. It's not the same political landscape. You can't just sort of play those games anymore.
In Donbass, heavy battles around Volnovakha, Starobilsk and Mariupol continued. In Kharkiv, Ukraine set a defensive line between Chuhuiv and Balaklia, preventing the Russians from encircling Kharkiv and moving towards Poltava and Dnipro. Numerous reports of heavy shelling of civilian areas in Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol and other cities of Ukraine continued. Also,
but it seemed now that the artilleries were sort of more focused on the strategic points they wanted this time, not necessarily on all of the military bases like the first initial bombardment was.
The first death of a Russian general in the war was reported, as the deputy commander of the 41st CAA, Major General Andrei Sukhovetsky, was allegedly killed. On a diplomatic front, as expected, the first round of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations in Belarus did not bring any positive results. The first day of March brought several setbacks to the Ukrainian defense. Reports of capture of Kherson and Melitopol meant that now the 42nd Motor Rifle Division was free to move towards Mykolaiv, while other units of the 58th CAA engaged in Melitopol could join the attack on Mariupol from the west, making the encirclement of the city a real threat. Reports of the Belarusian army joining the Russian offensive were not confirmed. On March 2nd,
we're literally only into the 1st and 3rd of March.
Western intelligence sources reported that Russia was switching its military tactic from head-on offensive on cities to attritional war, wearing down the Ukrainian army by continued assault on its defensive lines and shelling of Ukrainian cities to break the morale of the population, as the overall pace of their offensive remained well below expectations. Ukrainians report the reclaiming of Hlivka by the forces of the 96th Air Assault Brigade and Makariv by the defenders of the Kiev perimeter. During the next few days, both sides claimed to take Irpin, Bucha and Hostomel, towns in the vicinity of Kiev, the capture of which was crucial for the success of the Russian campaign in Kiev. It indicates that heavy fighting was going on around this area.
At what point do you think the Russians started realizing that this was going to be more difficult than they thought? Is it at this point now that they sort of changed in their stance from attrition? Do you think they still have a glimmer of hope of this still being relatively quick?
But these reports also stipulated that the Russian attacks were mostly carried out by 1 or 2 BTGs at the same time, which was interpreted by military experts as an inability for the Russian army to carry out coordinated attacks by a large number of units. Another point of the Russian offensive in the Kiev front was Brovary, but the attempts to push back the Ukrainian army there by the 41st and 36th CAAs were repelled. Within the next...
Once again, their efforts are just constantly being propelled, and they're just not going through at all. So the Russian president in the Cuban Missile cries too, but that caused his downfall when he gave Crimea away, basically. They tried to, however, if Europe had reacted this fiercely in 2014 when Crimea was taken, then there might not have been a war now. Complacency is deadly, as history has shown us time and time again. I do agree with that statement. we definitely should have reacted a bit more fiercely in 2014. But again, we were dealing with a lot in 2014, weren't we? Were we in the middle of a war then? I can't think. What was the political landscape back in 2014? Because it's completely different to the way it is now. Do you know what I mean? Six years, 2020 changed the political landscape of the Western culture. Crazy. COVID, for some reason, after COVID happened, everyone got involved in politics. It was interesting. Russia probably realised that it was going to be very difficult within the first 3 days. Ukraine had the Orange Revolution in 2014. Their military was a lot weaker. They lost Crimea very easily. They wouldn't have been able to retake Crimea in 2014. After that, they improved their army. Yeah, they also, it's mentioned in this video that after 2014, the West also started helping them with their military aids and equipment by providing them aid. So that's why afterwards the Ukrainian army got significantly better after 2014.
Several days, these unsuccessful attacks would continue. On other fronts, Russia took Balaklia, repelled the Ukrainian counterattack on Holivka, and engaged in heavy battle to take the Mykolaiv airport on March 3rd. But possibly the biggest gain of the Russian army on this day was the capture of Svatovo, which is situated between Kharkiv and Luhansk, by the 6th CAA and by the Luhansk militia.
Okay.
This allowed the Russian eastern and southeastern axes to link. The only positive result of the second round of negotiations was the agreement to open corridors for civilians stuck in encircled cities like Sumy, Chernihiv and Mariupol. On the 4th to 6th of March, Russia made important gains on several fronts. In the south, the 58th CAA took Enerhodar and the power plant in the vicinity, along with Tokmak and Vasilivka. There were also reports.
Wow, they really took the power plant between the 4th and 6th of March. I didn't realise it was that quick. I remember looking back on it and keeping up to date with it, but I don't remember it being that quick.
Of successful Russian advances on the Mykolaiv airport and heavy fighting in the Mykolaiv Oblast, which was defended by the 57th Motorized Brigade. Along with that, the 6th CAA and Luhansk separatist forces started attacking Izium and Severodonetsk. The fall of these cities could have been disastrous for Ukraine, as it could have possibly allowed the Russian units to encircle the 56th Motorized Brigade and other Ukrainian units fighting in Donbass. Heavy fighting was reported along the Chuhuiv-Balaklia line, which the Ukrainian defense managed to withstand. They were not as successful at the Nezhin-Preluki line, as the Russians were able to penetrate it, pushing within 20 kilometers of central Kiev from the northeast. The Russians also managed to encircle Okhtyrka. On March 7th, Ukraine managed to reclaim the Mykolaiv airport and Chuhuiv. The massive tank column.
So they start. It's such a back and forth, because they seem to be getting their little gains now, but it doesn't really. How much worth do those little gains have? You know, it's very, very interesting. Oh, so that was a different power plant I was thinking about. Cheers for letting me know, DZ.
In the west of Kiev still threatened the city, but no significant fighting or movement in that direction was reported. This was also the day when the first international volunteers joined the defense of Kiev. In the south, Russia repeated its tactic of bypassing the cities, which it failed to take with a head-on assault, as the 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division bypassed Mykolaiv towards Voznesensk.
Which is smart. If you're struggling to take the cities and bypass them, surround the cities and siege the cities and starve the Ukrainians out, obviously that's like, we don't... obviously that's the tactics that I would use if I was on the Russian side. Whether it's good or not is another thing to argue about, but that's the tactic I would use as well.
The aim was to force the southern Bug River and advance on strategically crucial Odessa. On March 8th, Russia took steps to solidify its encirclement of Mariupol by capturing the highway between the city and Volnovakha, while also moving elements of the 41st
Stopping them getting any
CAA to the
resupplies.
Sumy Oblast to strengthen its extended and constantly attacked supply lines. On the 9th to the 12th, the Ukrainian 1st Tank Division managed to repel the Russian offensive by the 90th Tank Division and the 55th Motorized Rifle Brigade on Chernihiv, along with establishing a connection with the pocket of resistance in Nizhyn. Heavy battles continued in Izium and Sevorodonetsk.
The fact they were able to sort of keep a line between the two pockets there, communication, so on and so forth, is very, very good and useful.
Donetsk. Russian offensives on Brovary by the 6th Guards Tank Regiment, on Godiach by the 4th Guards Tank Division, and on Krovoy by the 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division were also successfully repelled. But the Ukrainian situation around Mariupol continued to deteriorate as the Russian forces and Donetsk separatists moved into portions of the eastern part of the city, along with taking Volnovakha. The infamous tank column northwest of Kiev by now had dispersed and redeployed elsewhere. The most important
was that so the unit that had dispersed
by now had dispersed.
So that unit that had dispersed and redeployed somewhere else, was that the Ukrainian unit or was that a Russian unit there? Just sort of let me know. Liz Truss, Foreign Secretary, accidentally said that she will support UK citizens fighting in Ukraine. However, the UK army said it is illegal to fight for another army. Very interesting. Very interesting. So you're saying that the UK army is saying that it is illegal to fight for another army? Do you mean as a UK citizen you can only fight for the UK army? It is illegal to fight for another army? What if you have joint citizenship? What do you mean there?
And redeployed elsewhere. The most important event of the 13th to 16th of March was the ballistic strike at the Yavoriv training center near Lviv, as the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that 180 mercenaries were killed in this strike on the base.
Oh.
The training of foreign volunteers was conducted. By these dates, it had become quite clear that Russia had stalled in all directions and was unable to conduct any major offensive operations anywhere but Donbass. While the Russians made some gains in Izium and pushed around Rubizhne,
do you think the only reason why they had so much success in Donbass was because they have the rebel group fighting within that area?
The Ukrainian offensive towards Kherson pushed the 20th
It was a Russian
Motor
column
Rifle
that
Division
disappeared.
and
Thanks,
reached the
DZ.
town of Posad Pokrovska. The Ukrainians also broke the encirclement of Okhtyrka.
Oh,
On the 19th
nice.
to 20th of
So we're getting a bit of Ukrainian counter attacks here, a little bit. As a purely UK citizen, it is designed to prevent people becoming mercenaries, also to prevent diplomatic arguments within other countries. That makes sense. So you have to be purely UK citizen. So if you have a joint citizenship, you can go for both armies. That's very interesting. That's interesting that Liz Truss made a big mistake like that as well.
March, reports of Russian troops digging trenches and deploying minefields around Kiev indicate that the Russians had given up on offensive operations to take the capital and prepared for a defensive war. On March 21st to 24th, Ukraine gained ground around Kiev by counterattacking towards Bucha, Vozol, Moshchun, Makariv and Irpin, while Russia made progress in Izium and Mariupol. On the 25th to 29th of March, Ukraine capitalized on the low morale and poor supply of the Russian army and made considerable progress on several fronts. The Ukrainian army solidified its successes on the Kiev front by pushing back the 37th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade from Irpin, and
Just
the
getting their
90th
defences
Tank
set up
Division
on this
further
area.
away from Brovary, and reclaimed Lukyanivka. In the Sumy-Kharkiv axis, the 93rd Brigade took back Trostianets, Boromlia and Malarohan, and ended the encirclement of these
Big counter-offensive
city of
by
Sumy,
Ukraine.
forcing the 27th Guards Motor Rifle Brigade to withdraw to Russia for presumed redeployment in Donbass, where Russia still had a capability to launch a successful offensive operation and made some gains around Izium and Sevorodonetsk, along with capturing more of Mariupol, putting the Ukrainian defense of the city in an even more desperate situation. On the southern front, the Russian offensive had completely stalled as well. On the 30th of March, reports of withdrawal of several Russian units from the Kiev axis started to emerge, whether due to heavy losses or as part of a campaign to de-escalate military operations around Kiev. Along with that, redeployment of Russian units, such as the elements of the 30th CAA and the 1st Guards Tank Army to Belgorod for replenishment, to presumably later send them to the Donbass front, continued. During the next couple of days, we witnessed several instances of fighting on the northern front with Ukrainian success, and then a complete withdrawal of Russian units from Kiev and Chernihiv oblasts.
It really... How much do you think Putin was kicking himself when this all started going badly? Do you think he realised he made a bad decision? Yeah, because I think the full invasion was a bad decision for him. If he had have just went in for Donbass or if he had have just went in for Donbass or one of the other eastern regions and only stuck to those two, I think that it might have been looked upon in a different light. But the fact he went for a full whole invasion of Ukraine has obviously made him look like a warmonger and a war criminal.
The 35th, 36th and 41st CA.
I also agree. Do not trust anything that Liz Truss says, for sure.
5th, 36th and 41st CAAs made an orderly withdrawal towards Belarus, while reports of the redeployment of the 90th Tank Division and 2nd Guards Motor Rifle Division to the Donbass front emerged. On April 2nd, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry stated that Ukraine was now controlling all of the Kiev Oblast. On April 4th, the governor of Zhytomyr Oblast also stated that the region was now completely under Ukrainian control. By April 5th, there were no Russian troops left in the Chernihiv Oblast either.
Wow. I'm a bit naive. I didn't realise that they had completely evacuated the Russian forces out of the whole of the northern Ukraine. I didn't realise that. I thought they still had some pockets there.
Ukraine prevailed on the northern front and the Battle of Kiev against all odds. But Russian loss came at a very high price for the Ukrainian military infrastructure, and particularly the civilian population.
What an absolute pain in the arse. You lost so many, like Jay's saying, all those elite units that were used in the northern area to take Kiev, and all the loss of your veteran units within the north, for you to then just withdraw your units. What an absolute loss for not taking the objective. It's absolutely silly. You think that Putin kicked himself very hard, yeah? It's not just me who thinks that he realised he made a mistake. As long as it's not just me who thinks he made a mistake.
As the Ukrainian army reclaimed Bucha, it witnessed horrific scenes of hundreds of civilians lying dead on its streets. Satellite images taken on the days when the Russian army still controlled this town prove beyond reasonable doubt that this massacre was indeed committed by Russia. Ukraine also staged counterattacks in Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts. On the 31st of March, they liberated Melanivka, Vesela, Zelenyi and other towns in the Zaporizhia Oblast, along with several towns and settlements in the Kherson Oblast, including Novovorontsovka on the 1st to 2nd of April. But around the same dates, Russia continued very slow but steady progress in Donbass, as they claimed to capture Zolota Niva in the Donetsk Oblast and Zhytlivka in the Luhansk Oblast. On the 1st of April, Ukraine admitted that Russia was able to capture Izium after days of heavy fighting.
See, when Russia focuses their army within the areas they want to take, they seem to be doing well. But it seemed like when they sort of had it all split up, that it was just too easy to pick off.
But arguably, the most important event of this day was the Ukrainian strike on a fuel storage depot in the Russian city of Belgorod, which was the first incident of spillover of the war in Ukraine to Russian territory. On April 4th, reports of the advance of the Russian forces from the Kharkiv axis towards Slavyansk started emerging. According to various military experts, the capture of Slavyansk created options to link up with the Russian units fighting in Rubizhne or advancing towards Holivka. both of
Okay,
which carried
yeah.
a potential risk of encirclement for the Ukrainian units on the Donbass front. By the 5th of April, elements of the 1st Guards Tank Army, including elements of the 2nd GMRD, 4th GTD, 47th GTD, the 106th GAD, the 144th MRD, and the 3rd MRD, were redeployed to Izium, and we can expect most of the Russian offensive operations to be conducted along the Donets River, which the Ukrainian 25th Airborne Brigade
So they're building up a lot of forces on this area at this point in
and the
time.
81st Air Assault Brigade will try to defend. The presidential aide, Arestovich, noted in his interview that the Ukrainian army faces 8-1 numerical disadvantage on this axis.
8-1 on that region. 8-1
On the
disadvantage.
6th of April, it was confirmed that the Russian army completed its withdrawal from the Sumy Oblast too. These forces were to be redeployed in Donbass too. Lastly, the situation of the Ukrainian units in Mariupol was getting increasingly more desperate. According to British intelligence, by April 7th, Russia already controlled 76% of the city. But it is also reported that the Russian units participating in the siege of Mariupol are suffering heavy losses amid fierce resistance by the Azov Battalion and units of the regular Ukrainian army.
That area seems like it's a very difficult one to take. Remember that this video is pretty damn outdated at this point. Yeah, I do agree. It's been a while, hasn't it?
The run-up to and on the first few days of the war, almost everyone expected a quick Russian victory and the collapse of the Ukrainian army. It was only a question of when. But the Ukrainian army has defied the odds by standing tall and, more recently, prevailing in the Battle of Kiev and reclaiming some of the lost territories in other regions. Despite the overwhelming advantage in firepower, bad planning by the Russian command manifested in an inability to conduct major offensive operations in the coordination of a large number of units and different branches of the military. Poor logistical preparation was demonstrated by
There really was no logistics in this invasion. It looks
images
like
of incapacitated
it comes across to me as take Kiev, take Donbass, do what you can, and that's all he said to his generals. That's it.
military vehicles due to lack of fuel and insufficient food supplies proved by the Russian looting of civilian stores. Low morale, the clear indicator of which is scores of Russian servicemen, particularly conscripts, surrendering to Ukrainians, since they don't really understand what they're fighting for and are just completely unprepared for the brutality of war.
I think that Russian morale has sort of shifted over the last year or so.
Inability to ensure air domination, despite the huge numerical advantage in military aircraft, has made the Russian war effort in Ukraine go horribly wrong. Around Kharkiv and the south of Ukraine,
It is a big point to point out, like, most warfare nowadays is won by air superiority.
the Russians have been pushed back as well. The only axis where Russians and pro-Russian separatists can hope to gain any considerable success is the southeastern front. The Russian General Staff has stated in late March that its main focus is on the so-called liberation of Ukrainian-controlled territories of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, since it remains the only front where the Russians can realistically hope for success. Russia continues to employ the tactic of shelling cities, including civilian areas, causing the death of 1,611 civilians, according to the UN. Mariupol, Kharkiv,
According to the UN as well.
Sumy and other cities have been heavily damaged. Millions of Ukrainians have fled their country. Both sides have suffered heavy losses, but the Ukrainians have inflicted way more damage on the Russians than was expected. By April 7th,
Agreed. It was when this first happened, it was either Russia is just going to land roll and it's going to be over and done with, or it was going to be the Ukrainian surprising us for this long sort of attrition. So we're glad that the Ukrainians sort of were able to stop the initial rolled over invasion. But it's definitely surprising to a lot of people how well Ukraine are holding up, I think, for sure. all the redeployment to Donbass, and here we are in 2023 and still haven't advanced much. I agree. It's silly how little the Russians have been able to achieve throughout this whole war. Yeah, because Russia have to put up a hell of a resistance, and Russia has made many blunders as well. Also, sending undisciplined and untrained troops in recent weeks and months has not helped. Agreed, they seem to be doing a lot of conscription and getting conscription men to sort of attend these areas as well.
7th, Oryx military analysis blog visually confirmed Russian losses at 448 destroyed or abandoned tanks, 750 armoured vehicles, 20 fighter jets, 32 helicopters, and 3 navy ships against Ukraine.
3 navy ships as well. I didn't realise they took any naval
of
issues.
95 tanks, under 200 armoured vehicles, 18 aircraft and helicopters, and 15 ships.
Okay, so they've lost a hell of a lot more ships, but air security, they've lost barely anything. 18 fighters and jets and helicopters compared to the 20 jets Russia has lost and the 32 helicopters Russia has lost. The 200 armor vehicles, 500 different from the Russians, and only 95 tanks compared to the 448 tanks of Russia. Those numbers are crazy.
The 29th of March, 7 to 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine. The US sources reported on the 9th of March that 2 to 4,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed during the invasion.
But that's only from the 9th of March, and that's up to 29th of March. So there is 20 days unaccounted for between the difference of those two numbers, but that's still a big difference.
The second month of this conflict, which proved to be not the short, victorious war Vladimir Putin hoped for, but a war of attrition that could change the fate of the entire region. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
And I definitely think it could have been Vladimir Putin's one of his biggest blunders. Definitely, I think it is one of his biggest blunders. What a great